I woke up as a poor baker. Then a duke fell in love with me. Part 1 of 2. Chapter 1. The baker who shouldn't have existed. The first thing Stephen noticed was the smell. It wasn't fresh bread. It wasn't butter or roasted grain. It was damp wood, mold, and stale flour that had long since lost its life. He slowly opened his eyes and stared at the cracked wooden ceiling above him. Tiny beams of sunlight slipped through holes in the roof, illuminating countless specks of dust drifting lazily through the air. "Where am I?" His voice sounded unfamiliar. He pushed himself upright, only to wince as every muscle in his body protested. The bed beneath him was nothing more than dried straw stuffed inside a coarse linen sack. Every movement sent sharp stalks poking through the thin fabric. So this is what people call a bed. The room looked as though it could collapse if someone sneezed too hard. A crooked wooden table leaned against one wall. Empty flour sacks were piled in a corner. A stone oven, blackened from years of use, sat cold beside stacks of firewood. The tiny window barely let in enough light to brighten the room. This wasn't an old themed inn. This wasn't a historical museum. It was real. Too real. A wave of dizziness struck without warning. Pain exploded inside his skull. He grabbed his head as countless memories flooded his mind like a river breaking through a dam. Names, faces, places, a lifetime that wasn't his. Jared, 22 years old, the only son of a village baker. His mother had died from a fever when he was only 8. His father had spent years coughing blood into worn cloths while stubbornly continuing to bake bread every morning until tuberculosis finally claimed his life a few months ago. Since then, Jared had inherited the bakery. Inherited was a generous word. The bakery was barely surviving. Most days, he sold only enough bread to buy flour for the next morning. Some days, he didn't even manage that. The debts kept growing. The roof leaked. The oven cracked. And yesterday, Jared had worked himself to exhaustion before collapsing from hunger. He never woke up. So he's gone. Silence answered him. No divine voice. No explanation. No reason why he had taken over Jared's body. He let out a slow breath. I guess I'm Jared now. But before he was Jared, he was Stephen. Stephen Carter, founder and CEO of one of the largest bakery and restaurant groups in his world. He wasn't born wealthy. He built everything from nothing. While other college students worried about exams, he worried about supplier contracts, payroll, and whether his first bakery would survive another month. It did. Then came a second shop. The third. Cafe. A restaurant. Eventually dozens. Then hundreds. He had spent decades learning how people experienced food. Not just how it tasted. How it smelled. How it looked. How it made strangers become friends around a table. Food wasn't merely survival. It was culture, memory, comfort, love. He had dedicated his entire life to it. Then one ordinary evening, he remembered driving home after signing a contract for another international expansion. Rain hammered against his windshield. Bright headlights, a deafening horn, impact, darkness. And then, this place. He sighed heavily. If reincarnation exists, couldn't I have been born rich? A dry laugh escaped him. The sound echoed through the tiny room. No one laughed back. Outside, voices drifted through the open window. He stood and looked outside. A quiet village stretched before him. Simple wooden houses lined muddy roads. Children chased one another barefoot. Farmers carried baskets filled with pale vegetables that looked strangely lifeless. Even the market looked gray. There were vegetables, grains, some fruit, dried meat. Everything looked edible. Nothing looked appetizing. There wasn't a single spice stall. No herbs hanging to dry. No colorful produce. No fragrant smoke rising from kitchens. Even from a distance, the entire village felt tasteless. His stomach growled. Jared's memories guided his feet downstairs into the bakery. Several loaves sat on wooden shelves. He picked one up. Dense, hard, cold. Felt more like a brick than bread. He tore off a piece and bit into it. That's it. It was somehow both dry and wet. chewy and crumbly. It carried the faint taste of grain and absolutely nothing else. No salt, no sweetness, no richness, nothing. He forced himself to swallow. I've had emergency survival rations with more flavor. Curious, he searched the pantry. The shelves were nearly empty. A sack of coarse flour, a few onions, something resembling cabbage, a jar of animal fat. That was all. No herbs. He searched again. No pepper. Nothing. No garlic. Nothing. No cinnamon. Nothing. Not even dried leaves that resembled bay or rosemary. How was that possible? Then another memory surfaced. Salt was expensive. Herbs were considered weeds. Most plants growing in forests were believed to be poisonous unless proven otherwise. People simply didn't experiment. Centuries of fear had reduced cooking to the absolute basics. Survive first. Enjoy later. Except, later never came. As he continued searching, he noticed another basket shoved beneath a table. Inside were several odd-looking mushrooms with thick stems, bright orange flowers, and clusters of unfamiliar leafy greens. Jared's memories immediately identified them. Worthless. Wild plants. Not food. Animals occasionally nibbled on them. People avoided them. He stared at the mushrooms. Back in his world, those looked remarkably similar to oyster mushrooms. The flowers resembled squash blossoms. The greens looked almost identical to water spinach. Impossible. He carefully picked one up. The shape, the smell, the texture. Years of working with food had sharpened his instincts. They weren't identical, but they were close enough that his heart started racing. What if? He rushed outside. Near the bakery grew vines carrying strange green fruits. No one had harvested them. According to Jared's memories, they were decorative plants. Decorative? He cut one open. Inside were seeds surrounded by soft flesh. This is basically squash. A little farther away stood trees bearing round yellow fruit scattered across the ground. Rotting. Untouched. Too sour to eat, the villagers believed. He picked one up and smiled. It smelled suspiciously like citrus. Nearby, children chased each other while kicking aside another plant covered in tiny red berries. Poisonous, according to common belief. To him, they looked alarmingly similar to wild tomatoes. He slowly turned in place. The forest, the fields, the gardens. They weren't empty. They were overflowing. The people simply didn't know what they had. His pulse quickened. This kingdom wasn't suffering because food was scarce. It was suffering because knowledge was. He looked down at the rough loaf still sitting in his hand. For the first time since waking in this strange world, he smiled. Not because life had become easier, but because he had finally found something familiar. Ingredients. Real ingredients. Hidden in plain sight. If these are what I think they are, I won't just rebuild this bakery. He looked toward the distant hills where endless forests stretched beyond the village. I'll change the way this entire kingdom eats. Far away, beyond those forests, nobles feasted on expensive grain while villages struggled to survive on tasteless bread. Jared had dreamed only of keeping his father's bakery alive. Stephen had once built an empire from flour and determination. Now, in this unfamiliar world, those two lives had become one. Chapter 2. The Forgotten Taste. The first thing Jared did the next morning was drink a cup of water. Or at least he tried to. He stopped just before the cup touched his lips. That can't be right. Holding it against the morning light, he frowned. The water wasn't clear. It had a faint gray tint, with tiny particles lazily floating inside. It wasn't thick enough to be alarming to someone who had lived here all their life, but to Stephen's eyes, it looked distinctly unclean. He took a cautious sip. The taste was earthy, not unpleasant, but muddy. There was a lingering bitterness that coated his tongue. He walked outside with the wooden bucket in hand, following Jared's memories toward the center of the village. A stone well stood in the middle of the square, surrounded by villagers filling buckets while chatting about the day's work. Everyone drank from it. No one questioned it. Jared peered over the edge. The water below was deep enough, but bits of leaves floated on the surface. The stone walls were coated with moss, and the rope used to lower the buckets looked like it hadn't been replaced in years. No wonder, he muttered under his breath. Back on Earth, he had visited several factories and farms over the years. Clean water had always been the foundation of any food business. No clean water, no good bread, no good soup, no healthy customers. He wasn't an engineer nor a scientist, but he remembered one of the simplest filtration methods ever taught in school. Pebbles, sand, charcoal, simple materials anyone could find. Back at the bakery, Jared quietly placed the wooden sign outside. Closed today. He ignored the disappointed glances from the few customers who stopped by before leaving. Today wasn't about making bread. It was about fixing the very thing used to make it. He spent the morning gathering supplies. Smooth river pebbles, coarse gravel, fine sand from the riverbank, the black charcoal left behind inside his father's stone oven. He scrubbed everything thoroughly before layering them inside an old wooden barrel whose bottom he had carefully pierced with several tiny holes. Pebbles first, then smaller stones, a thick layer of clean sand. Finally, crushed charcoal. He poured the cloudy well water into the top. Slowly, drop by drop, crystal clear water emerged from the bottom. Jared stared at it for a long moment. He dipped a finger inside before tasting it. Much better. The muddy aftertaste had nearly vanished. It wasn't perfect. Boiling would still be safer. But compared to what the villagers normally drank, it was a remarkable improvement. He smiled. One problem at a time. By midday, he slung a woven basket across his shoulder and headed toward the forest. According to Jared's memories, only hunters entered these woods. Not because monsters lived there, but because villagers believed the plants growing inside were cursed. Anything unfamiliar was dangerous. Anything colorful was suspicious. Anything with a strong smell was avoided. Stephen almost laughed. To him, the forest looked less like danger and more like an untended supermarket. He walked slowly, letting years of experience guide his eyes. There, bright red fruit hanging from tangled vines. He picked one and sliced it open with a small knife. Juicy, sweet, slightly acidic. Tomatoes. Nearby grew long green pods, with some ripening into vibrant red. Peppers. Not particularly spicy, but fragrant enough to transform any dish. Further ahead, half buried beneath loose soil, leafy stalks revealed themselves. Jared knelt. He brushed away the dirt. White bulbs. Several cloves joined together beneath a papery skin. His eyes widened. No way. Garlic. Real garlic. He laughed aloud, startling a pair of birds into flight. This world really has everything, except people willing to taste it. His basket steadily filled. Wild onions. A handful of fragrant herbs resembling thyme. Broad leaves similar to bay leaves. A few mushrooms that matched oyster mushrooms almost perfectly. The deeper he ventured, the more convinced he became. Nature hadn't failed this kingdom. Knowledge had. On his way home, fortune smiled upon him once again. A rabbit darted across the underbrush. Jared froze. Years of camping and survival hobbies suddenly resurfaced. He quietly fashioned a simple snare using rope from his basket. Took patience. Nearly half an hour. But eventually, snap, the rabbit struggled briefly before settling. I'm sorry. He gently ended its suffering. I'll make sure nothing goes to waste. The afternoon sun bathed the bakery in golden light as Jared prepared his ingredients. The rabbit was cleaned and portioned. The tomatoes were chopped into uneven pieces. Garlic was crushed beneath the flat of his knife. Peppers sliced into thin rings. He rendered a little animal fat inside a cast-iron pot. The moment the garlic touched the hot fat, sizzle, a rich aroma burst into the room. Jared closed his eyes. He hadn't realized how much he had missed that smell. It was warm, comforting, alive. Next came the onions, then the peppers, finally the tomatoes. The vegetables slowly melted into a vibrant sauce unlike anything this world had likely ever seen. He added the rabbit meat, fresh herbs, A pinch of salt from the precious little Jared had left. The stew simmered gently as the flavors slowly came together. Steam curled from the pot carrying scents of roasted garlic, sweet tomatoes, savory meat, and fragrant herbs. The tiny bakery, once filled only with the dull smell of flour, suddenly felt alive. Jared couldn't stop smiling. This smells like home. Outside, a woman carrying laundry suddenly stopped. Do you smell that? Her husband sniffed the air. It smells wonderful. Across the road, two children looked toward the bakery. Is someone baking sweets? No, another villager said. It smells like meat. But I've never smelled meat like that. One by one, curious villagers wandered toward the small bakery. Mrs. Elric, the elderly widow living next door, hesitated before knocking gently on the open door. Jared. He turned around. Oh, hello. She blinked. The scent washing over her nearly made her dizzy. What are you cooking? Others slowly gathered behind her. Hunters, farmers, children, even the village blacksmith. No one spoke. They simply stood there, breathing deeply as the unfamiliar aroma drifted through the afternoon air. For the first time in years, the old bakery wasn't known for stale bread. It had become the source of the most irresistible smell anyone in the village had ever experienced. Jared looked at the growing crowd and smiled to himself. They hadn't even tasted the food yet, and already, their understanding of what food could be was beginning to change. Chapter 3. The Village That Learned to Taste. The villagers stared at the steaming pot as though it contained poison, which, considering the ingredients, was understandable. Mrs. Elric wrung her hands nervously. Jared, are you certain this is safe? I've eaten it, Jared replied with a smile. As you can see, I'm still alive. A few people chuckled, though uneasily. The village hunter leaned over the pot and frowned. I recognized these herbs. My father always told me they were cursed. And those red fruits, another woman added. My grandmother said they make people sick. Jared picked up a tomato from the basket beside him. In my experience, they're delicious. The villagers exchanged doubtful glances. And the white bulbs? Asked the blacksmith. Garlic. They smell terrible. They smell wonderful when cooked. Silence followed. Finally, Mrs. Elric sighed. I suppose I'm old enough that if I die from curiosity, it won't be the worst way to go. The crowd burst into laughter. The tension eased. Jared filled a small wooden bowl and handed it to her. She accepted it with trembling hands. Everyone watched as she slowly scooped up a piece of rabbit coated in the rich red sauce. She hesitated, closed her eyes, and took a bite. The bakery fell completely silent. Mrs. Elric's eyes flew open. She froze. Another bite followed. Then another. Without realizing it, tears began rolling down her wrinkled cheeks. Oh! Her voice cracked. It's warm. The others looked at one another in confusion. Of course it's warm, the blacksmith said. No! She shook her head. I don't mean the temperature. She pressed a hand against her chest. It feels warm here. Jared understood immediately. It wasn't merely food. It was comfort, a feeling this world had forgotten. Mrs. Elric thrust the bowl toward the nearest villager. Stop staring and eat before it gets cold. The blacksmith reluctantly accepted it. He took one cautious bite. His eyebrows shot upward. What in the? Another bite, then another. He looked at Jared with utter disbelief. The meat. It's tender. And the sauce. It has layers. What are layers? One farmer asked. I don't know, the blacksmith admitted, but it tastes like there are different tastes happening at the same time. Soon everyone wanted a spoonful. Children who normally complained about eating vegetables eagerly reached for tomatoes. Hunters, who had avoided garlic their entire lives, asked for more. Even those convinced the herbs were poisonous found themselves scraping the bottom of the pot. When the last drop disappeared, disappointed groans filled the bakery. One little boy tugged on Jared's sleeve. Mister, can you make it again tomorrow? Jared smiled. If I have the ingredients. The boy grinned so brightly that Jared couldn't help laughing. Within days, the entire village was talking about the bakery. People no longer referred to it as the old bread shop. It had become the place with the amazing smell. Villagers who had once crossed the street to avoid Jared's struggling business now lined up outside before sunrise. Some brought vegetables from their gardens. Others offered fresh eggs or milk in exchange for a bowl of whatever Jared happened to cook that day. Many were simply curious. Every customer left smiling. Success gave Jared room to experiment. The first thing he tackled was the bread. His father's recipe wasn't terrible. It was incomplete. The dough barely rose, resulting in dense loaves that felt heavy enough to use as building stones. The problem wasn't the flour. It was the lack of yeast. Thankfully, Stephen remembered the simplest methods of cultivating wild yeast. He mixed flour and clean water into a paste and left it covered with cloth. Each day he fed it a little more flour and water. At first, nothing happened. Then tiny bubbles appeared. A faint sour aroma followed. By the 5th day, the mixture had doubled in size. Jared couldn't stop smiling. There you are. He folded the lively starter into fresh dough. This time, he waited patiently. Hours later, the dough had nearly doubled. After baking, he sliced into the loaf. Soft, airy. The crust crackled beneath his knife while steam escaped from the center. He tore off a piece. It sprang back beneath his fingers. He closed his eyes after taking the first bite. Perfect. Not quite like the artisan bread from his previous world. But compared to anything this kingdom had ever known, it was revolutionary. Then he experimented further. Some loaves contained fragrant herbs. Others included roasted garlic. A few were filled with caramelized onions and wild mushrooms. One became his personal favorite, a savory loaf seasoned with crushed peppers and aromatic herbs. The bakery soon smelled so inviting that villagers joked it was impossible to walk past without becoming hungry. Business continued to grow. The bakery itself was far too small. Jared couldn't afford renovations, so he improvised. Using spare lumber, he built 3 rough wooden tables and a handful of chairs. They weren't elegant. One table leaned slightly to the left. Another wobbled whenever someone rested an elbow on it. Still, people happily sat down. Every morning Jared wrote the menu on a wooden board outside. Today's meal: rabbit stew, fresh herb bread, vegetable soup. Tomorrow's menu would be entirely different. It depended on what the forest and nearby farms provided. People loved the surprise. The little bakery slowly transformed into the village's first restaurant. Travelers passing through stopped after catching the irresistible aromas drifting onto the road. Many intended only to buy a loaf. Most stayed for lunch. A merchant from the western provinces ordered 2 bowls of stew, then a third. Before leaving, he purchased 6 loaves of garlic bread for the journey. "I've visited cities across the kingdom," he told Jared. "I've never eaten anything like this." Another traveler laughed while wiping his bowl clean with the last piece of bread. "I should charge you compensation." Jared blinked. "For what?" "My wife will never be satisfied with my cooking again." The small dining room erupted with laughter. Several travelers began making deliberate detours through the village simply to eat there. Word spread from village to village, carried by merchants, hunters, pilgrims, and wandering craftsmen. Everyone spoke about the mysterious young baker who somehow turned ordinary ingredients into unforgettable meals. Nearly 2 weeks later, far to the north stood Blackstone Castle, the seat of Duke Carmichael. Unlike many nobles, Duke Carmichael rarely hosted lavish feasts. There was little reason to celebrate. The kingdom's harvests had steadily declined over the past decade. Fields produced less grain each year. Villages struggled through every winter. Food shortages had become the crown's greatest concern. Recognizing his talent for organization and practical leadership, the king had entrusted Duke Carmichael with overseeing the kingdom's food security. Every report concerning harvests, grain reserves, and famine relief eventually landed on his desk. It was a burden he accepted without complaint. Even so, solutions remained painfully scarce. One afternoon, Several maids chatted while preparing the dining hall. "I heard the strangest rumor," one said. "About what?" "A little bakery in Ashfield Village. The one where travelers keep stopping?" "Yes. They say the baker cooks plants everyone believes are poisonous." Another servant laughed. "And no one dies?" "They actually ask for more." A passing steward slowed his steps. "I've heard the same. They say people are traveling there just for the bread." The conversation reached the ears of a tall man reviewing reports nearby. Duke Carmichael looked up from the mountain of parchment before him. "A bakery?" The steward bowed. "Merely village gossip, Your Grace." The Duke tapped a finger thoughtfully against the table. "People rarely gossip about ordinary bread." "No, Your Grace. And travelers are changing their routes to visit it?" "So the reports claim." Duke Carmichael closed the harvest ledger. For weeks he had been reading reports filled with failed crops, shrinking grain stores, and desperate requests for aid. Yet here was a tiny village bakery attracting attention for reasons that made little sense. A baker using plants no one else considered edible. It sounded absurd, which made it interesting. He looked toward his attendant. "Send someone to Ashfield Village." The attendant bowed immediately. "What should they investigate, Your Grace?" "Everything." The Duke's gray eyes settled on the map spread across his desk. "The baker, the food, and how one insignificant bakery managed to become the most talked-about place in the countryside. For reasons he couldn't explain, he had a feeling the answer might be worth far more than a good meal." Chapter 4. A taste worth trading. By the end of the month, Jared's little bakery had become the busiest building in Ashfield Village. The morning crowd came for the bread. The afternoon crowd came for whatever dish Jared had prepared. The evening crowd came because the aroma drifting from the bakery was impossible to ignore. Even travelers had begun timing their journeys to pass through the village around lunchtime. Jared still found the attention a little overwhelming. He had gone from worrying about selling a single loaf of bread to wondering if he had enough tables. 3 tables. That was all his little restaurant had. Every seat was occupied before noon. One particularly busy afternoon, a merchant caravan stopped outside. Only one wagon this time. Its wheels creaked beneath the weight of several wooden crates stacked neatly in the back. The driver stretched his aching back before stepping inside. "I've heard stories about your cooking," the middle-aged merchant said, brushing dust from his sleeves. "They're probably exaggerated." Jared smiled. "They're not." One of the customers interrupted while happily tearing apart a loaf of garlic bread. "Order 2 servings. You'll regret ordering only 1. Laughter filled the room. The merchant chuckled. "Then I'll trust the experts." A short while later, he finished every last bite of rabbit stew. He even wiped the bowl clean with the final piece of savory bread. He leaned back with a satisfied sigh. "I've been traveling these roads for nearly 20 years. I don't think I've ever enjoyed a meal this much." Jared thanked him before curiosity got the better of him. "You travel often?" "Nearly every province." "What do you sell?" "Whatever people need. Cloth, metal, grain, stone, salt." That final word caught Jared's attention. "Salt?" The merchant nodded. "I've got several crates. May I see?" "Of course." Outside, the merchant pried open one of the wooden crates. Inside weren't neat white crystals. Instead, large grayish-white rocks filled the crate, chunks ranging from the size of a fist to nearly the size of a human head. Jared blinked. "So this is how they sell it. You've never seen rock salt before?" the merchant asked. "I've only seen small pieces," which wasn't entirely a lie. The merchant picked one up. "It comes from the eastern caves. We mine it, chip it apart, then traders carry it across the kingdom. No one has ever tried gathering it from the sea?" The merchant laughed. "The sea? What would salt be doing there?" Jared smiled awkwardly. "Just a thought. Apparently, this world had discovered underground salt deposits long before anyone thought to evaporate seawater." "Interesting. How far is the coast from here?" Jared asked casually. The merchant rubbed his beard. "If you travel by horse, perhaps 4 or 5 days. Longer with wagons. Jared quietly committed that information to memory. One day, he wanted to see the ocean, not only for salt. Who knew what kinds of seafood this world had ignored? His imagination immediately filled with grilled fish, shellfish, seaweed, and dozens of possibilities. But those dreams could wait. Right now, he needed salt. "I don't suppose you'd trade?" The merchant grinned. "I was hoping you'd ask. What are you offering?" Jared disappeared into the bakery before returning with several freshly baked savory loaves still warm from the oven. The rich scent of roasted garlic and herbs drifted into the air. The merchant's eyes widened. "Those are for me? If the trade is fair." The merchant didn't even hesitate. He broke off a piece and tasted it. A blissful expression spread across his face. "Done." He handed Jared several generous chunks of rock salt. "I think I'm the one getting the better deal." Neither man argued. Both walked away satisfied. That evening, Jared carefully crushed part of the salt into smaller crystals using a stone mortar. The result wasn't perfectly refined, but it worked. As he stored the precious seasoning away, another idea surfaced. "I've made bread. I've made stew. What about pasta?" He laughed. "If flour exists, there's no reason pasta can't." He mixed flour with eggs from one of the villagers and a little water before kneading the dough until smooth. He rolled it as thin as he could with a wooden pin. Not perfect. Far from it. Still, it was recognizable. Long strips of fresh pasta. For the sauce, he simmered tomatoes with garlic, onions, herbs, and a little rendered fat. Simple, rustic, comforting. He gently tossed the cooked noodles through the sauce before placing the finished dish on the table. Jared stared at it. Spaghetti. His first bowl of pasta since arriving in this world. He took a bite. His shoulders relaxed. It wasn't identical to the recipes from Earth. The flour was different. The tomatoes were slightly sweeter. The herbs had unfamiliar notes, yet still tasted like home. The next day he added it to the menu. The villagers were fascinated by the strange long noodles. Some loved it. Others struggled to figure out how to eat it. One elderly farmer attempted to bite the entire bowl at once, sending sauce onto his beard. The children found the noodles entertaining. "This food wiggles," one declared before happily slurping them. It wasn't nearly as successful as the rabbit stew. Most customers still preferred bread. Still, Jared couldn't stop smiling. This world has its first pasta. That achievement alone made him absurdly happy. The following morning surprised everyone. Instead of opening before sunrise, a wooden sign hung outside. "Closed today." The disappointed groans could be heard from halfway across the village. "What do you mean closed? I walked here before breakfast. I wanted the herb bread." Mrs. Elric laughed. "Let the poor boy rest." Little did they know, Jared wasn't resting at all. Basket in hand, he headed back into the forest. His goal today wasn't dinner. It was tomorrow, and the day after. The tiny yard behind the bakery had gone mostly unused for years. That was about to change. He carefully dug up young tomato plants, pepper seedlings, wild garlic bulbs, fragrant herbs, anything that could survive transplantation. "If I keep depending entirely on foraging, eventually I'll run out." He wanted a sustainable supply, proper kitchen garden. Something every restaurant back on Earth would have appreciated. While walking home, he noticed the familiar tree covered in bright yellow fruit, the same one everyone ignored. He picked several. Their scent immediately confirmed his suspicion. Lemons. He sliced one open. The aroma was sharp, clean, and unmistakably citrus. Jared grinned. Lemonade. The thought alone made his mouth water. Fresh water, lemon juice, a little honey, perhaps sugar someday if he discovered sugarcane or sugar beets. The only thing missing, ice. He looked toward the warm afternoon sun. That's a problem for another time. Still, even warm lemonade would be a welcome change from plain water. He filled his basket. The villagers passing by simply shook their heads. There goes Jared again, picking sour fruit. If he serves it, People will probably line up for it anyway. At this point, no one was willing to question his judgment anymore. Several days later, Blackstone Castle. Duke Carmichael sat inside his study while an attendant placed a leather folder onto the desk. "The investigation is complete, Your Grace." "So soon?" "The village is small." The baker was easy to observe. The Duke opened the report. Inside were neatly written notes. Name: Jared. Occupation: baker. Family: deceased. Education: none of note. He continued reading. His brow gradually furrowed. Uses: plants believed to be inedible. Has introduced softer bread through an unknown fermentation process. Travelers are altering their routes specifically to dine at his establishment. Villagers report fewer stomach ailments after he encouraged boiling and filtering drinking water. The Duke paused. "Filtering water?" "Yes, Your Grace," the attendant replied. "He apparently built some sort of device using stones, sand, and charcoal." Carmichael reread that line. "Interesting. Very interesting." He turned another page. Customers willingly exchange goods instead of coin. Several neighboring villages have begun imitating his cooking. The bakery has become the busiest business in Ashfield Village. The final sentence caught his full attention. Recommendation: the individual known as Jared may possess knowledge capable of improving the kingdom's food supply and public health. Further observation is strongly advised. The room fell silent. Duke Carmichael closed the report. He rose from his chair and walked toward the window overlooking the castle grounds. For months he had searched for solutions in reports from scholars, nobles, and royal advisors. None had offered anything truly new. Yet a young baker in a forgotten village had quietly improved bread, meals, and even drinking water without anyone's guidance. A faint smile tugged at the corner of the Duke's lips. "I think it's time I met this remarkable baker myself." Far away, in his tiny bakery, Jared was planting tomatoes in the afternoon sun, blissfully unaware that the most powerful noble in the kingdom had just decided to pay him a visit. Chapter 5. The Duke's Visit. The following week was the busiest Jared had experienced since inheriting the bakery. Before sunrise, villagers had already begun forming a line outside. By noon, every one of the 3 tables inside was occupied, while several customers simply stood outside with bowls in hand, happily eating beneath the shade of an old oak tree. Jared moved constantly, kneading dough, turning patties over a hot iron griddle, cutting potatoes into thin strips before lowering them into bubbling animal fat, refilling cups, washing bowls, taking orders. If someone had told Stephen, the former owner of a restaurant empire, that he would one day be running the kitchen, dining room, and cashier all by himself, he would have laughed. Now he barely had time to breathe. Mrs. Elric emerged from the kitchen carrying a basket of bread. "I've already told you," she scolded. "You need help." "I know. You've been saying that for a week." "I know. So hire someone." "I know." She narrowed her eyes. "If you say, 'I know' one more time, I'll hit you with a loaf of bread." Jared laughed. "I know." The elderly woman swatted his shoulder with a towel instead. The nearby customers burst into laughter. That day's special was something Jared had spent several days perfecting. Freshly baked soft buns, ground rabbit mixed with herbs and onions, shaped into thick patties before being grilled over charcoal, slices of ripe tomato, crisp wild greens, a simple sauce made from mashed tomatoes, garlic, herbs, and a touch of honey, served alongside thin strips of fried potatoes sprinkled generously with crushed rock salt. The potatoes had been another fortunate discovery. The villagers had long believed they were fit only for feeding livestock. Jared nearly cried when he found them. How could anyone ignore potatoes? He had immediately planted several in his garden. Until those matured, he continued gathering wild ones from nearby fields. The meal had quickly become another favorite. The villagers didn't know what to call it. Some referred to it as meat bread. Others simply asked for that sandwich thing. Jared gave up trying to explain. Just as he placed another plate on a customer's table, the room suddenly became unusually quiet. The conversations stopped. Wooden spoons paused halfway to waiting mouths. Several villagers hurriedly stood. Jared glanced toward the entrance. A tall man stepped inside. His dark coat was simple but clearly tailored from expensive cloth. Silver embroidery decorated the cuffs. A sword rested calmly at his side. Behind him stood two attendants. Though dressed modestly, their posture revealed disciplined military training. The man's sharp gray eyes calmly surveyed the room. There was authority in the way he carried himself. Not arrogance. Confidence. Jared recognized him immediately. Duke Carmichael. So, he finally came. Around him, several villagers quickly lowered their heads. Your Grace. What brings the Duke here? Has someone done something wrong? The room grew tense. Carmichael's gaze swept across the bakery before settling on the man standing behind the counter. You must be Jared. Jared wiped his hands on a clean cloth before walking forward. Instead of throwing himself onto the floor like everyone expected, he simply gave a respectful bow. Welcome to my bakery, Your Grace. No trembling, no panic, just calm professionalism. The Duke noticed immediately. So he isn't intimidated. Interesting. I've heard quite a bit about your cooking. I hope the rumors haven't exaggerated too much. A faint smile appeared on the Duke's face. I intend to find out. Jared gestured toward the only empty table. If Your Grace would like to dine, I'll prepare today's special. I would. Unlike the anxious villagers secretly watching from the corners of the room, Jared treated the Duke exactly as he treated every other customer. He toasted the freshly baked bun until lightly crisp, grilled the rabbit patty over glowing charcoal, added slices of tomato, fresh greens, a generous spoonful of sauce. Beside it, he served golden fried potatoes. Finally, he poured a tall wooden cup of pale yellow lemonade. No ice, unfortunately, still refreshingly cool from the cellar beneath the bakery. Jared placed everything before the Duke. Today's special, a hamburger and fried potatoes, along with fresh lemonade. Carmichael studied the meal carefully. He had attended royal banquets prepared by the kingdom's finest chefs. None had served anything remotely resembling this. He picked up the strange sandwich. Am I supposed to eat it with my hands? You can. It was designed that way. The Duke glanced at Jared. You designed it? I did. Without another word, Carmichael took a bite. His expression didn't change, but inside, he was astonished. The bread was impossibly soft. The meat remained juicy. The tomatoes added brightness. The herbs filled every bite with fragrance. The sauce tied everything together into something unlike anything he had ever eaten. He calmly swallowed before taking another bite. Then another. His attendants exchanged discreet glances. They had served the Duke for years. They knew exactly what that meant. His Grace liked it. Very much. The fries disappeared next. Simple. Crisp. Perfectly salted. Finally, Carmichael lifted the cup. The lemonade's bright citrus aroma reached him before the drink itself. He took a sip. Refreshing. Sharp. Balanced by just enough sweetness. He lowered the cup. What fruit is this? Lemon. I've seen those. They're unbearably sour. They are. So why does this taste pleasant? Because sourness isn't something to eliminate. It's something to balance. The Duke looked thoughtfully at the cup before taking another drink. Balance. An interesting way of thinking. When the meal was finished, the Duke set down his cup. You've answered one question. Jared tilted his head. And what's that? The rumors were understated. Several nearby villagers smiled proudly, as though Jared's compliment somehow belonged to the entire village. The Duke folded his hands. Now I'd like the answer to another. Jared had expected this. You've introduced ingredients the kingdom has ignored for generations. He gestured toward the kitchen. Tomatoes, garlic, peppers, potatoes, lemons. You've improved bread through a method no baker seems familiar with. You even taught villagers to filter their water. His sharp gray eyes met Jared's. How? The bakery became silent once more. Even the children stopped eating. Jared looked at the Duke for several quiet seconds. He had rehearsed this conversation countless times in his head. He couldn't tell the truth, that he had lived another life, that he remembered another world. No one would believe him, or worse, they would. I can't answer that. The Duke didn't look offended. Can't. Or won't. Jared smiled politely. Both. The attendants stiffened. No one spoke to the Duke so directly. Yet Carmichael remained calm. You understand I'm acting on behalf of the crown. I do. And still you refuse? I do. The Duke leaned back slightly. May I ask why? Jared's expression softened. Because knowledge is easy to steal. The answer caught Carmichael off guard. Jared continued. I've spent weeks proving these ingredients are safe. I've experimented. I've failed. I've succeeded. If I simply hand over every answer without knowing how it will be used. He shook his head. I can't do that. The Duke studied him in silence. Most people would have begged for noble favor. Some would have offered every secret they possessed in hopes of a reward. Instead, this young baker calmly refused. Not out of disrespect, but conviction. After several long moments, Carmichael stood. I see. To everyone's surprise, there wasn't even a hint of anger in his voice. Instead, there was curiosity. As frustrating as your answer is, I respect it. Jared inclined his head. Thank you, Your Grace. The Duke turned toward the door before pausing. I'll return. Jared smiled. I'll have something new on the menu. For the first time that day, Duke Carmichael laughed. It was quiet, brief, but genuine. I look forward to it. As the Duke departed, the bakery slowly returned to life. Only after the door closed did the customers collectively release the breaths they had been holding. Mrs. Elric hurried over to Jared. You refused the Duke. I did. Are you out of your mind? Jared chuckled as he picked up another order. Maybe. But he came here for food. So that's exactly what I gave him. Far down the road, Duke Carmichael glanced back once at the tiny bakery. He had arrived expecting to investigate an unusual cook. Instead, he had met a man whose confidence matched his remarkable talent. For the first time in many years, the Duke found himself genuinely intrigued by someone. And he suspected this would not be their last conversation. Chapter 6. An unexpected invitation. The little bakery continued to surprise the village. Every few days, Jared unveiled something new. His customers had long stopped asking whether the ingredients were edible. Instead, they asked the far more important question. What are you cooking today? One afternoon, the answer came in the form of fragrant smoke rising from a charcoal grill built behind the bakery. Several skewers of boar meat sizzled over glowing coals. Jared had marinated the meat overnight using crushed garlic, wild herbs, ground peppers, honey, and a splash of fermented fruit vinegar he had begun making himself. As the fat slowly dripped onto the charcoal, sizzle, smoke carrying an irresistible sweet and savory aroma drifted across the village. A farmer walking past suddenly stopped. That smell should be illegal. The blacksmith laughed. I came to repair a horseshoe. I somehow ended up standing in line for lunch. Jared turned the skewers carefully until every side caramelized into a beautiful golden brown. He brushed them with another layer of the glaze before serving them alongside fresh herb bread. The villagers fell silent after the first bite. One customer pointed dramatically at the skewer. This is what boar was supposed to taste like? Another nodded vigorously while chewing. I hunted boars for 20 years. I owe every one of them an apology. Laughter erupted around the tables. A few days later, Jared decided to prepare something lighter. Early that morning, he carried a handmade fishing rod toward the nearby stream. The water flowed gently over smooth stones, clear enough to see small fish darting between patches of river grass. Within an hour, he caught several fish about the length of his forearm. Back at the forest, he continued gathering ingredients. It was there that fortune smiled upon him once again. Growing beside a damp patch of earth were familiar green stalks. He knelt immediately. Lemongrass. Nearby, thick roots pushed through the soil. He brushed away the dirt. A warm, spicy aroma filled the air. His eyes widened. Ginger. He actually laughed aloud. You beautiful world. You've been hiding everything. Back in the bakery, he cleaned the fish before stuffing each one with slices of ginger, crushed garlic, and fresh lemongrass. He steamed them over boiling water inside a covered clay pot. The resulting aroma was delicate, fresh, completely different from the rich grilled meats his customers had become accustomed to. Many hesitated, until they tasted it. It's so clean. I didn't know fish could taste this fresh. The meat melts apart. One elderly fisherman scratched his head. I've caught fish my entire life. Apparently, I've also been ruining them my entire life. Several mornings later, just as Jared prepared to leave with his basket for another foraging trip, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the village. Hooves slowed before the bakery. Jared looked up. Duke Carmichael had returned, this time accompanied by only 2 attendants. The Duke dismounted gracefully. I hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all. Jared held up his empty basket. I was actually heading into the forest. The Duke glanced toward it. For ingredients? Among other things. A playful thought crossed Jared's mind. Would your grace like to come? The attendants immediately looked alarmed. Your grace? Carmichael raised a hand, silencing them. I believe I'll manage. He turned to Jared. I accept. The attendants watched in stunned disbelief as the Duke handed over his horse's reins before following a village baker into the woods. The forest was quiet. Birdsong echoed through the trees while sunlight filtered through the leaves overhead. Unlike their previous meeting inside the bakery, conversation came naturally. You know these woods well, the Duke observed. I'm learning. You seem to discover something useful every time. I get lucky. The Duke gave him a skeptical look. I don't think luck alone explains everything. Jared only smiled. Soon they reached the stream. I thought we'd catch today's lunch. You fish as well? A little. That turned out to be an optimistic description. Jared stepped onto a smooth rock extending over the water. I think I see one. The Duke approached carefully behind him. Where? There. I don't. Before either finished speaking, the rock shifted beneath Jared's foot. Oh no! His arms pinwheeled wildly. Instinctively, he grabbed the nearest thing. Unfortunately, the nearest thing was Duke Carmichael. What are you? Splash. Both men disappeared into the stream. Water exploded upward, soaking everything within several feet. For one perfectly silent moment, neither surfaced. Then Jared emerged first, coughing. His hair clung messily to his forehead. Across from him, the Duke rose from the water looking equally startled. They stared at one another, then simultaneously looked toward the fish calmly swimming away. We lost them, Jared said. We did. A heartbeat passed. Then the Duke began laughing. Not politely, not quietly, actually laughing. Jared blinked. I wasn't aware your grace could make that sound. It appears I can. Soon Jared was laughing too. The attendants, who had wisely remained behind with the horses, would later swear they had never heard the Duke laugh like that before. The laughter faded as the reality of their soaked clothing became impossible to ignore. My shirt weighs as much as armor, Jared muttered. So does mine. The Duke removed his damp outer coat before pulling the soaked shirt over his head. Jared turned instinctively, and immediately wished he hadn't. The Duke's physique was impressive. Broad shoulders, defined muscles earned not from vanity but years of swordsmanship and riding. Several pale scars crossed his chest and abdomen, each telling a story Jared suspected involved battles better left unasked. Jared's face warmed. I. His brain abruptly forgot how words worked. The Duke noticed. Is something wrong? No. Yes. I mean no. Carmichael raised an eyebrow. You seem unusually flustered. I'm perfectly fine. Jared very deliberately stared at a nearby tree. The tree is interesting. The tree. Very. The The Duke followed his gaze toward the completely ordinary oak. "I've seen better trees." That only made Jared laugh harder. "I don't doubt it." A few moments later, the Duke noticed Jared's own shirt dripping. "You should remove yours as well." Jared nearly choked. "I think I'll leave mine on." "As you wish." Neither mentioned the awkward exchange again, though the faint smile lingering on the Duke's lips suggested he found the entire situation rather amusing. After eventually catching enough fish and avoiding any further accidental swims, they returned to the bakery. Jared disappeared into the kitchen. This time he had something special planned. He stretched fresh dough into wide circles, spread a rich tomato sauce across each one, added slices of roasted boar, wild mushrooms, fresh herbs, soft cheese he had recently begun making from cow's milk. Everything disappeared into the blazing stone oven. Minutes later, the crust emerged golden. The cheese bubbled gently. The aroma filled the entire bakery. Jared carried one to the table. "This is called pizza." The Duke studied it curiously. "It doesn't resemble any bread I've seen." "It isn't. And yet it is." That explanation wasn't particularly helpful. Jared grinned. "I know." Using a knife, he divided it into slices. The Duke picked one up. He bit into it. The crisp crust gave way to soft bread, savory meat, tangy tomato, creamy cheese, fresh herbs. Every ingredient complemented the others. He quietly finished one slice, then another. His attendants were no more restrained. One of them reached for a third slice before realizing the Duke was watching. He slowly withdrew his hand. "Forgive me, Your Grace." The Duke calmly took the slice instead. "I was about to eat that." The attendant looked positively heartbroken. Jared laughed so hard he nearly dropped the serving board. When the meal ended, Carmichael wiped his hands. "I've delayed this conversation long enough." Jared nodded. "I assumed there was another reason for your visit." "There is." The Duke's expression became serious. "You've transformed this village in only a matter of weeks. People eat better. They're healthier. Travelers carry your ideas beyond Ashfield." He leaned forward. "The kingdom needs that knowledge." Jared remained silent. "I want your help. Help me improve the kingdom's food security. Teach farmers. Teach bakers. Show us what we've overlooked." The bakery became quiet. Even Mrs. Elric stopped pretending not to listen. Jared looked down at his hands. He had expected this question eventually. The opportunity before him was enormous. So was the responsibility. After a long silence, he finally spoke. "I can't answer today." The Duke nodded once. "I wasn't expecting an immediate answer. I'll need time. There are things I have to consider." "Very well." Carmichael stood. "I'll give you that time." He paused before adding, "But I hope your answer will be yes." Jared watched the Duke leave through the bakery door. Outside, the afternoon breeze carried the scent of fresh bread and herbs across the village. He had only wanted to keep a failing bakery alive. Now the future of an entire kingdom was quietly resting on a decision only he could make. Chapter 7. A deal for the kingdom. For 3 days, Jared gave Duke Carmichael no answer. He continued baking bread before sunrise, prepared soups at noon, experimented with new recipes after sunset. To everyone else, nothing had changed. Inside his mind, however, the Duke's proposal refused to leave. It wasn't a simple invitation. If he accepted, he would no longer be changing one village. He would be trying to change an entire kingdom. That was a responsibility Stephen understood all too well. In his previous life, every decision he made affected thousands of employees and millions of customers. One careless choice could ruin livelihoods. This was no different. Except now, the stakes were even higher. People's lives depended on food. On the 4th morning, Jared closed the bakery earlier than usual. Mrs. Elric watched him untie his apron. "You're finally going." "I suppose I am." "The Duke has been patient." "He has." She smiled knowingly. "I think you've already decided." Jared smiled back. "Maybe." Blackstone Castle was every bit as imposing as the stories claimed. Its dark stone walls towered over the surrounding hills. Soldiers stood at attention along the gates. Servants hurried through the courtyards carrying baskets, ledgers, and supplies. Yet despite its size, the castle lacked extravagance. Everything was practical, organized, efficient. It reminded Jared of a well-managed company rather than the home of one of the kingdom's most powerful nobles. He was led into the Duke's study. Carmichael looked up from several harvest reports. I wondered how long it would take. I needed time. I expected as much. The Duke closed the ledger. Have you reached a decision? Jared took a slow breath. I'll help. The Duke's eyes softened ever so slightly. But, Jared continued, I have conditions. I assumed you would. The Duke leaned back. Let's hear them. Jared walked toward the large map spread across the desk. The kingdom stretched across the parchment. Large cities, small villages, forests, mountains, roads. He pointed toward one of the smallest settlements. My knowledge can't stay here. His finger slowly moved across the map. It can't belong only to nobles, or wealthy merchants, or the royal court. He looked directly at the Duke. If I teach better farming, if I teach edible plants, if I teach cooking, it must reach everyone. He tapped another tiny village. Even places like this, the villages most people forget. The people starving the most. Silence filled the room. Finally, Carmichael nodded. I agree. The answer came without hesitation. Jared blinked. That quickly. The Duke smiled faintly. You've just described exactly what I hoped you would say. Jared hadn't expected that. Perhaps they wanted the same future after all. He continued. My second condition. He pointed toward the rough lines representing the kingdom's roads. These. The roads. They're terrible. The Duke laughed quietly. I can't argue with that. When merchants transport food, wagons get stuck. When roads become mud, crops arrive late. Fresh food spoils. Trade slows. Villages remain isolated. He met the Duke's eyes. You can grow all the food you want, but if you can't move it, it won't matter. Carmichael folded his arms. I've argued the same point to the Royal Council for years. And they complain roads cost money. They do. But hunger costs far more. The Duke's smile widened. I'm beginning to like how you think. I'll push the matter again. This time with stronger evidence. Jared nodded. Satisfied. My final condition. He hesitated. This one sounded far stranger. I want to visit the sea. The Duke raised an eyebrow. The sea? Yes. For what purpose? Jared simply smiled. I'll explain when we get there. Which wasn't entirely true. He certainly couldn't say, because your kingdom is ignoring an endless source of salt, fish, shellfish, and seaweed. Every conversation he'd had confirmed the same thing. People ate ordinary fish. But shrimp, crabs, clams, oysters, mussels, they considered them little more than strange sea insects. Things only desperate people might touch. Stephen wanted to cry every time he heard it. An entire coastline, wasted. If you'll indulge my curiosity, Jared added, I'd appreciate it. The Duke studied him for several moments before nodding. Done. You have my word. Carmichael stood from his chair. Then I have one condition of my own. Jared had expected as much. What is it? Wherever this project takes us, you'll remain under my supervision. Jared frowned. You mean, travel together? I do. I can't ask you to advise the kingdom while allowing you to wander wherever you please. It would also be safer. Safer? Jared almost laughed. I've survived quite well on my own. I don't doubt it. The Duke's expression remained calm. But you're becoming increasingly valuable. To the kingdom. And perhaps to people who might wish to exploit your knowledge. That gave Jared pause. He hadn't considered that. Not everyone would welcome change. Some merchants profited from expensive salt. Some nobles benefited from hungry villages dependent on their grain. Knowledge threatened established interests. I hadn't thought about that. I have. The Duke crossed his arms. So? Jared sighed. I suppose having the kingdom's strongest duke nearby isn't the worst arrangement. So you agree? I do. The Duke extended his hand. Then we have an agreement. Jared shook it. The deal was made. Returning to Ashfield Village proved more difficult than expected. Not because of the journey, because Jared suddenly realized he couldn't simply abandon the bakery. The villagers certainly wouldn't allow it. When he announced his plans, the reactions were immediate. What do you mean you're leaving? Who's making lunch? What about my herb bread? Mrs. Elric smacked several worried customers with a wooden spoon. Would you all calm down? He isn't dying. Jared laughed. I'm only traveling. I'll still come back. The villagers looked only slightly reassured. Over the following weeks, Jared searched for trustworthy people. Eventually he found 3. Thomas, a quiet young hunter with an excellent memory. Mina, the blacksmith's energetic daughter, whose curiosity rivaled Jared's own. And Owen, a farmer's son who genuinely enjoyed baking. Every morning before opening, Jared trained them. This herb. He held up several similar-looking plants. Safe. This one. He lifted another. Will make your stomach regret every decision you've ever made. The 3 apprentices laughed, then immediately began memorizing the differences. He taught them how to identify tomatoes before they ripened, how to distinguish edible mushrooms from dangerous ones, how to recognize fresh herbs by smell instead of appearance alone. He even took them into the forest. Never harvest everything. He pointed toward a patch of wild garlic. Leave enough so it grows again. If you take everything today, there'll be nothing tomorrow. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. So we're farming the forest. Jared smiled. In a way. Back inside the bakery, they learned recipes. Bread first, then soups, then grilled meats. Eventually, even pizza. The first pizza Mina attempted looked vaguely like the kingdom's map. The second looked slightly less disastrous. By the 5th attempt, it actually resembled a circle. We're making progress, Jared declared. Owen laughed. The bread tastes better than it looks. That's what matters. Each day they grew more confident. Soon, Jared found himself stepping back while watching them cook. They still made mistakes. Too much salt, too little heat, bread left in the oven a little too long. But the heart of his cooking remained. Fresh ingredients, balance, respect for food, and curiosity. As he watched the 3 apprentices laughing while preparing lunch together, Jared felt something he hadn't expected. Relief. The bakery no longer depended entirely on him. It had become something larger, a place where knowledge was shared instead of guarded. Exactly as he hoped the rest of the kingdom might one day become. Outside, a royal carriage rolled quietly into the village. Duke Carmichael had returned, not to investigate this time, but to collect the man who intended to change the kingdom one meal at a time. End of Part 1. The Part 2 of this story is already uploaded. Thank you and enjoy.